If you'd like to take your seats, please, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. So, just a few health and safety things. I haven't done this for a while, actually. If the fire alarm goes off, it's an incredibly loud, horrible bell, and we all have to leave by this exit here. And at the bottom of the stairs, you go immediately left into the car park, and so on. And if I'm here, obviously, I will be the leader. Follow me. The toilets are over there, through those double doors, which are very stiff. You have to give them a good, strong, hard push. And there are also toilets downstairs near the box office. We have a packed programme of events for November and December, most of which are up on the website, and the leaflet, I'm hoping, will be available towards the end of next week, as I just spent the evening proofreading it. So, anyway, without more to do, please welcome the eminent film historian, Anthony Slide.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you all for coming. This evening I'm going to sort of ramble on, the way I tend to do as I get older, about silent stars I knew fairly well, about my early life and so forth, and my relationship with them. And the first half of the program will be devoted to people from British cinema, the second half to a small selection of people from American cinema. So I think the easiest way to start is for Dave to show some photographs of me with some of the silent people I've known for the years. So here goes. That's me. Yes. Now here I am and that is Audrey Melbourne Cooper, whose father was Arthur Melbourne Cooper, the film pioneer. She was a darling, wonderful lady. And that is Harold Dunham. Here I am with Jon Stewart, outside the National Film Theatre. And here is Jon Stewart with Mabel Polton impersonating Erich von Stroheim and the dummy in The Great Gabbo. Mabel's very well equipped for such a role, and here's dear Mabel, who loved her drink as much as I do. And here I am with actually Ronald Neame, whose autobiography I edited, and Donna, his wife. Here I am with Blanche Sweet, who I escorted to the opening of the D.W. Griffith Theatre in New York. With more about Blanche later. And here I am with Lillian Gish, when we both got awards at the same time. You notice I'm getting steadily older. Here I am with actually Mrs. Wallace Reid, early pioneering actress and film director. Here I am with Ethel Grandin, the star of the 1914 Traffic in Souls. And here I am with Pauline Stark, who began her career at Fine Arts with D.W. Griffith in the 1910s. She doesn't look that good. Here's Robert Gitt, Carla Laemmle, me, and next to me is Lon Chaney's leading lady from The Phantom of the Opera, Mary Philbin. Here I am with Marjorie Wilson, Brown Eyes in Intolerance, Viola Dana, the Metro star, and Mignon Anderson, the leading lady with the Tannhauser, or Tannhauser, as some people mispronounce it, company. Here I am with Priscilla Bonner, Harry Langdon's leading lady in The Strong Man and the star of The Red Kimono. And here I am looking somewhat drunk with Mary Bryan, a very dear friend of ours. And here's where it really all began, 140 Westbourne Terrace, London, West 2. Which really, it is a grade 2 listed building, but it should be grade 2 listed, in fact, for the people who lived there and for what went on there. It was actually built in 1848, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel lived there while he was building Paddington Station. And it was here I moved, thanks to a gentleman named Leslie Flint, who was the president of the Valentina Memorial Guild and a well-known direct voice medium, which I'm not into parapsychology or medium and seances and so forth, but Leslie had a very high reputation for communing with the dead, particularly with Valentino. And it was sort of fascinating because Leslie would tell you about how Valentino and Ivor Novello were together now, and Ivor was writing shows that Valentino was starring in. So it's interesting. And where was I? Anyway, 140 Westbourne Terrace. I lived there in a flat on the first floor. Leslie Flint and his partner Bram lived in the basement. On the ground floor was a lady who had been a prominent member of the Raj in India and actually had had Merle Oberon's mother as a maidservant. And then on the top floor was a man named Michael Hall. And it's not the Michael Hall who was the star of Dexter and 6 Feet Under, but Michael Hall, who was Myrna Loy's Myrna Loy's son, I should say, in The Best Years of Our Lives. So a very interesting house. And it's from here that Paul O'Dell and I edited The Silent Picture from 1968 onwards. And it's here where the Valentina Memorial Guild would meet once a month. And actually, it's here that I once invited the members of the Raymond Navarro fan club, of which I was a member, for a screening. And unfortunately, my projector didn't work. So we all trooped down to the basement, and in the Valentina Memorial Guild screening room, we watched a Raymond Navarro film. It was all very civilized, very English. We had afternoon tea, and it was really quite delightful. Anyway, so the Valentina Memorial Guild. Let's look at some home movie footage of the Valentina Memorial Guild. Shot, I believe, in the late 1960s, and the lady with the sunglasses is Dagmar Godowski, Valentino's leading lady in A Sainted Devil. The gentleman behind her is Leslie Flint. This is a gentleman who wrote a book. Oh, sorry, too late, missed him. This gentleman here wrote a book on Valentino in 1951. That is Burt Langdon, the film collector there on the left. And there's me on the right. And we have the members of the Valentina Memorial Guild and Leslie's dogs, Dagmar and Burt Langdon. And here we have Ros Crawford of the Sis and Ros Crawford sisters. Now, how many people here remember Sis and Ros Crawford? Good, good. So, quite extraordinary ladies. I don't remember the name of this lady. She lived in New York, and she was a friend of Dagmar. Somebody asked Dagmar once how many husbands she had, and she said, 2 of my own and several of other people's. Oh, she also used to stay at the Strand Palace Hotel. And when she was asked why she stayed at the Strand Palace, she said they gave a special rate for stars. So, that is Bram, Leslie Flint. Oh, too late. That is Bram, Leslie Flint's partner. By the way, Leslie Flint wrote an autobiography called Voices in the Dark, which is quite fascinating, in fact. I remember, I didn't have a television back then, and I was very poor, and Leslie and Bram would invite me down on Sunday nights to watch their television. And I remember once, here we are in Paris, actually, going to see a screening of The Conquering Power at the Cinémathèque Française. Well, I guess actually we're just boarding the plane. Here we are on the Champs-Élysées. I'll get back to what I was saying earlier. Bram, Leslie Flint's partner. And here I am, looking very distinguished, I must say. And there I am again, laughing with Leslie Flint. And there is Ros Crawford, Sis Crawford, and Bram's sister. God, when was this shot? It must be about 1970, I'm guessing. I was actually talking earlier that I used to go down there to watch television in their flat on the Sunday evening, and one evening I sort of noticed there was a strange sort of cloud hanging over the room. And I said to Leslie, what is that, Leslie? And he said, it's ectoplasm. It hasn't dematerialized yet. So I thought, so I had to sort of dodge the ectoplasm when you went in the flat. Actually, somebody else is shooting that because there's Bram wearing the sunglasses. I think Bram's, no, it's not Bram's sister. I don't know who's shooting it. Maybe me. And here we are at the Cinémathèque Française, about to go in to see The Conquering Power. You know, back then, of course, you couldn't see films on DVD or VHS. So if you wanted to see a rare film like The Conquering Power, you had to travel all the way to Paris to see it. Here I am. Here's Leslie and Bram's sister. And I don't, unfortunately, remember the name of the lady on the right. There we are. Sis and Raz Bram and his sister. And there we are. Aside from 140 Westbourne Terrace, I think the individual and the place where I really came to love silent films was the council flat on the first floor of Queen's Crescent in Kentish Town, where lived a film collector named Bert Langdon. He had been a piano maker, that was his trade, and he collected 35 nitrate films. And Saturday evenings at Bert's were wonderful experiences. Basically, he would show original nitrate prints on a hand-cranked Powers projector, and he would have this huge library of 78 records, and he miraculously would crank the projector with one hand while he was putting the records on the turntable with the other, and he could actually, you know, change records and whatever. I mean, we never thought actually of the danger that the fact we were sitting here in the living room and we were sitting in front of the projector. The only way out of the living room was behind the projector, so if the film caught fire, we were doomed. But it never occurred to us. And I think we were a very sort of lucky group, actually. There was me, there was Sis and Ros Crawford, who you saw. There was Harold Dunham, who you also saw briefly then. And Harold Dunham was a marvelous film historian who nobody remembers today. He wrote some great pieces in Films in Review on Mae Marsh, Robert Harron, and he worked for many years on a history of the G.B. Samuelson studios and G.B. Samuelson himself. And I wish that one day those memoirs might be published. Bert alternated screenings with a guy named Frank Shelton, who lived in Palmer's Green, and he basically rented one room on the ground floor of a house where he also had a 35 projector set up, also with a whole room full of nitrate films, and he would show early talkies. So, as I say, one week it was early talkies, the next week it was silent films. We were a sort of small, privileged group, and there weren't many outsiders who came there. Ron Grant came sometimes. I certainly remember Ron there. And Kevin Brownlow, I think I only remember Kevin coming once, and that was he brought his own 60mm projector and a film of Surrender, which was a Universal production. It was the only American film that the great Russian actor Ivan Mozhikin had made. And unfortunately, Kevin wasn't particularly pleased because everybody in the group immediately said that Ivan Mozhikin looked like Harry Langdon. And Kevin got quite, as I remember, quite offended by this. Someone else I remember coming was Ken Russell. And in fact, when I watched The Boyfriend, and there's a sequence in The Boyfriend, a dance number, and I thought, that is actually lifted entirely from an Fitzpatrick Music Masters short of the 1920s on Ethelbert Nevin, an American composer. And the dance sequence in that film is identical to the one that Ken Russell later recreated in The Boyfriend. Bert eventually had a stroke, and so he couldn't actually project and change the record. So I sort of took over the projection for a while, and I realized just how difficult it was to hand crank a 35mm projector, because you had to watch the screen carefully to make certain you weren't cranking too quickly or too slowly. And at the same time, your hand was sort of aching, and at some point you wanted to change hands, but you couldn't stop the cranking, so you had to do it like this and suddenly start doing it with the other hand. I have so much admiration for Bert for what he did. And it was sort of sad at the end, really, because Bert eventually sort of lost his job as a piano maker, and the BFI hired him, but to work in Lower Marsh, cleaning and prepping films. Here's this man with such a marvelous knowledge of silent films, and the BFI just gives him this shit job, if you will. I thought that was quite tragic in a way. And even more tragic was towards the end, the stroke affected Bert so much he decided to dispose of his nitrate film collection. And he approached John Huntley, who was working at the BFI then, and he sold the film collection to John Huntley, thinking he was selling it to the BFI, but he wasn't. He was selling it to John Huntley. So none of the films ever went to the BFI. And that is a tragedy, because so many of those films were there, some of them were unique. And to give you some idea of what films were there, I'm going to show you about a reel, basically, that Bert put together of film clips, British film clips. And quite a few of these, I believe, actually probably all of them are unique. So Dave, shall we start the British silent film clips? Here we are. Here we see Betty Balfour, more about whom later. And here we see a scene from the lost film Vivalli, directed by George Pearson, starring Betty Balfour. And Bert actually had the whole film. I mean, the BFI today talks about how this is one of the most important of lost British films, but I used to see it regularly. Bert Langdon would show it maybe twice a year. We saw it many, many times. And where is it now? Who knows? This actually, what happened was I told Bert how much I would love to have some footage of Vivalli, and Bert took this to Henderson Film Labs. He made a 16mm reversal print for me, and I've actually just made a DVD from that 16mm print. Frankie Stanmore, I believe. This is a really nice shot. Stuart Rome, of course. Here's Betty Balfour. Here she is again. These clips are in sort of no real order. They're just the way Burt put them together. Here we see Jon Stewart. Now this is the next, we're going to see 3 World War I propaganda shorts, I guess you'd call them, starring Chrissy White and Henry Edwards. I don't believe I believe these films are actually lost, apart from what you're seeing here. Of course, it's a British film, so we have to have a dog in it. Now we go back to Vivalli. Yes, I know I should have edited these into some sort of order, but there's a limit to my capabilities. But as I say, this is how Bert sort of actually sort of had them on the reel. As you might guess, the film deals with the aftermath of the First World War. The little boy is actually George Pearson's son, Owen. After his father's death, Owen gave me George's director's chair and also the typewriter he used to write all his scripts and also his autobiography. The typewriter I deposited at the National Film Archive, and I hope it's still there. The chair I eventually donated to the University of Essex. No, I'm sorry, the University of Exeter. Dave, let's stop at this point, so rather than go on. Thanks. And we won't, well, no, we won't do any more in this room. I was very lucky that I knew George Pearson fairly well. In fact, he gave me his notes for the making of the film. I've got some of them here, talking about Vivalli. First time principles are seen, give opportunity to see faces long enough. In all work, be careful to move in close up or move out for continuity of action. Think of music, avoid flatness. I mean, he kept quite meticulous notes on what he wanted on his films. He was at that point living at a nursing home in Malvern in Worcestershire, and I used to go and visit him occasionally at the weekends. And I always thought it would be sort of marvelous to take Betty Balfour there. And Betty at that point had become a recluse. Nobody really knew where she lived or anything about her except that she wouldn't appear in public. But I thought, well, what the hell? So I wrote a letter to an address in North London that I told sort of at least she used to receive mail, if nothing else. And much to my amazement, I told her that I was going to go up to Malvern that coming Saturday. And on the Friday, the telephone rang. It was Betty Balfour who said, yes, she'd like to come up with me to Malvern to see George Pearson. And so we traveled up together, quite a traumatic experience for everyone. I have my notes here that I wrote at the time, and I'd like to read them to you. I met Betty Balfour on March 1, 1969. Together we traveled to Malvern to visit George Pearson. It was the first time they had met since 1957. Betty still looked beautiful, dressed in a simple black dress with matching earrings and necklace, and wearing a fur coat and a fur flower pot-shaped hat. She is a tiny creature with a soft, pleasant voice and obviously well-educated. From our conversations, it became clear that she is very unhappy with a persecution complex. She told me that she had made her first stage appearance at the age of 8, and at the age of 10 starred in a French play. She then had an offer to work in the French theatre, but her guardians, her aunt and uncle, turned the offer down because they realized there would be more money in it for them if she were to appear on the English stage and in films. Betty believes that she was exploited by them and believes that she has been exploited ever since. She told me that if she ever had her life over again, she would never make a film. I said to her that perhaps if she was happy now, she would not be if it were not for past happenings. She replied, "Who said I'm happy now?" She believed that every director with whom she worked, excepting Hitchcock, had compassion, and that it was impossible to be creative without having compassion and understanding. Marcel L'Herbier she considered a fine director. Louis McCanton was a charming person but had no idea how to direct. Love, Life and Laughter she considered her greatest film. Hitchcock was a horrid person, vulgar and cruel, always playing practical jokes on people. The story of Champagne, the film that she made for Hitchcock, was made up as they went along. George Pearson she considered the greatest of all British silent directors. The trouble was that he was a perfect gentleman and would not stand up against the business element in the film industry, in particular his partner Tommy Walsh. Her husband, Jimmy Campbell, would have been a millionaire, but he was too easygoing, and she says died of drink. Her son, David, was educated at Gordonston and Madrid University, and his knowledge of Spanish gained him a good position with Schweppes. However, he married a German au pair girl, and they both turned against Betty. She told me that she would never give her address to anyone because it upset her so much for people to recognize her as Betty Balfour and for her to be regarded as a curiosity. Betty and I actually became quite friendly. Betty would often take me out to dinner where she would drink a great deal. But she certainly had a sort of persecution complex. For example, I remember once we went to the Cumberland Hotel for dinner, and the pianist there was playing one of Jimmy Campbell's songs, Try a Little Tenderness, which had been written for her. And once the pianist started playing, it was like, oh my God, they know I'm here, they know who I am, we have to go. And it was quite ridiculous in a way, you know, and sad. The most memorable visit I had with Betty, we went on 2 occasions to visit George Pearson. The most memorable visit was a few months later. And obviously it was quite traumatic for Betty. So when first of all, on the train going up, we changed trains, I think, at Worcester. And on the second train, we were sitting in a compartment with a lady, and suddenly Betty started talking to her in French. And I thought, well, sort of odd. And then the woman started responding in French. So a long conversation was going on in French, despite the fact that both women were English. And it was like Betty suddenly decided she was going to speak in French for the rest of the trip. When we got to Malvern, Betty decided, oh, we should take a present for George. Let's buy a bottle of whiskey. So we stopped and bought a bottle of whiskey. We got to the nursing home, and there was the matron to greet us saying, would you like a drink? And Betty said, no, we brought our own. And so we went in, and Betty had several glasses of whiskey and became considerably vocal. After the meeting, we went back on the train, and it was like the journey from hell as far as I was concerned, because we got on the train and Betty said, let's go into the buffet car and have something to eat. Well, there wasn't a buffet car. But Betty being Betty said, well, they can set a table up for us and serve us. So she persuades the staff on the train to set a table and to provide food and whatever, and she buys a couple of bottles of wine. And every time a member of the staff went by, she would give them a glass of wine. So we would have the conductor go by, the ticket collector, and she would be giving them glasses of wine. And then she suddenly said, what about the train driver? We should give him some wine as well. And they say, madam, you know, we can't give it to the train driver while he's driving the train. She said, well, when we get to Paddington. So we got to Paddington, and there's Betty sort of lurching down the platform with 2 bottles of wine in her hand and climbing up onto the cab to present a very puzzled train driver with a couple of bottles of wine. I was absolutely horrified. I was just like total state of panic and fear. Anyway, luckily, on that visit, I brought a tape recorder with me, and I had persuaded Betty that I really wanted to interview George, and would she help? So Betty said, oh, well, of course. So we made this tape-recorded conversation with me, Betty, and George Pearson, and I'm going to play you a few minutes of it now. You're the first people to have heard this recording since 1970. First of all, you'll be surprised that Betty doesn't sound anything like you would imagine the characters she played on screen would sound like. She really is quite regal and very well educated, and it comes across despite her, obviously, alcoholic state. George is unfortunately getting rather, we used to call it senile. I guess you don't these days. But certainly he was rather out of it, and he didn't really know what was going on too well. And so there was quite a lot of Betty trying to persuade George to tell us something that George didn't understand anymore. Anyway, Dave, can we play the audio?
When I had to say, have you the bleeding heart? And the newsagent said, no, but I've got the bloody hump. And you asked me to register my expression to the camera. So you said, look at Aunt Sally over there. My God, there was my aunt. It was one of the greatest things you ever did. George, don't you remember, I have been trying to tell Tony how you were the first with solid sets.
She's talking about Love, Life and Laughter.
The sets. And you had them solid, plastered. You know, not like these awful doors that open and then they wave. You know, and Harry Jonas was there. And do you remember the Stairway to the Stars? But do you remember the sets? The scenery? It was so marvelous. And Hollywood copied it 10 years later. Don't you remember, darling? Darling, you must remember.
Yes, I think I do. Bit balmy.
No, darling, because I think it was one of the first films that Percy Strong photographed. You remember Percy Strong?
Who?
Percy Strong.
Yes.
Have you got one photograph of Love, Life and Laughter?
No Life and Laughter.
Because
It was, was it a story? Was it a story of a woman who had 3 sons?
no.
Not that one.
It was the story of a boy who was very artistic and believed that life wasn't so good, and a girl who believed that one should laugh. Don't you remember, my uncle died during the film. Extraordinary how those stills have been lost.
Was that the story?
You wrote it, darling.
No.
Harry Jonas.
They had to meet after 10 years.
Yes, I think so. To see who was right.
And I remember you had to go up a staircase.
Yes. And do you remember the balloons?
Yes, the balloon went right up.
Yes.
Frankie Stanmore was the balloon blower. And Nancy Price was up in the sea dancing.
Annie Esmond.
Annie Esmond,
Sydney Fairbrother.
Nancy
And
Price.
Sidney Fairbrother.
That's right. Sidney Fairbrother. It's a good film.
It was the finest.
Poor Betty. It was actually after that trip that Betty told me, which at that point nobody else knew, that George Pearson had tried to initiate an affair with her. He'd offered actually to leave his wife and move in with her, and that's basically why the George Pearson-Betty Balfour filmmaking relationship ended. I actually told someone about this, and since then, I guess it's been repeated over and over again as to what happened. But in fact, it was Betty telling me where it originated. Betty didn't even know that George had actually died in 1973, and I was by that time living in the United States, and I wrote to her telling her that George was no longer with us, and she wrote back, the address is 5 Lennox Gardens, SW1. Tony dear, this is dated April 23rd, 1973. Tony dear, your letter was the only information I received of George's death. There was no mention in the newspapers or over the radio. Poor George. He was in many ways a complex character. Now he is free of all loneliness and frustration. God bless and love, Betty. So, and that sort of ends my involvement with British silent films. I obviously knew a lot of other people from that period, particularly Jon Stewart and Mabel Poulton. Had many drunken, I seem to have spent many evenings being drunk with these people. Many drunken evenings with Mabel Poulton and her husband Richard in their apartment on Callow Street in Chelsea. But in 1971, I moved to the United States and basically have been there ever since. So we're going to end the first part of the show now. We're having a brief intermission, at which point I'd be happy to sell you copies of my books. And we will return, and I will be talking about some of the silent stars I have known in the United States. So, intermission. Thank you.